Morning, people. Rishi Sunak just cancelled a whole bunch of policies that they put in place to tackle climate change and to reach net zero. And as you can probably tell by the fact that I'm sitting here talking to you, it includes a whole bunch of misleading propaganda. So let's talk about it. But before we start, let's get something clear. Most reasonable people believe we should tackle climate change, but that the cost of doing so shouldn't fall on the poorest people in society and should instead be paid for by the richest who can afford it. And with the UK being one of the most financially unequal countries in the Western world, when you hear Mr. I like to brag about defunding poor areas to help rich ones say that he's scrapping climate protections to make sure that poor people have enough money, you should smell the bullshit. Now first we start with the classic Tory manipulation technique where you say that if you don't vote with me, all this crazy stuff will happen, even though that stuff is never really on the table. Like when they said that Turkey was about to join the EU or that we'd be forced into some EU army. Especially as he talks about them as proposals. So these are ideas that his government has made and he's supposedly saving us from himself.
The debate about how we get to net zero has thrown up a range of worrying proposals. And today I want to confirm that under this government, they will never happen. The proposal for government to interfere in how many passengers you can have in your car, I've scrapped it. The proposal that we should force you to have 7 different bins in your home, I've scrapped it. The proposal to make you change your diet and harm British farmers by taxing meat, or to create new taxes to discourage flying or going on holiday, I've scrapped those too.
Again, most people were not suggesting that you tax the average family as they try to go on their one flying holiday a year. We were maybe suggesting that you tax people who fly within the UK, like flying to Leeds in a private jet, like Rishi Sunak does.
No one can watch the floods in Libya or the extreme heat in Europe this summer and doubt that it is real and happening.
Okay, so you understand that climate change is a real and life-threatening problem facing the world. So on that basis, I would assume that you would agree that every country should be doing all they can to fix that problem, regardless of what their neighbours happen to be doing.
And when our share of global emissions is less than 1%, how can it be right that British citizens are now being told to sacrifice even more than others?
The UK is less than 1% of the global population, so, what's your point? See, this is why, and I know I talk about this with Brexit, but international comparisons are such a dangerous argumentative tool because they can be used so easily to manipulate people. Other countries doing worse than us doesn't mean that we shouldn't do better, and when the stakes are fires and floods, we should do the best we can. And given that so much of the stuff that we consume is made in China, we've effectively exported our carbon emissions to China, and then we use China's high carbon emissions as an excuse to emit more carbon, because that lets us think that we're not as bad as them. But the biggest announcement was that they're pushing back the date at which you'll no longer be able to buy a new petrol or diesel car.
You'll still be able to buy petrol and diesel cars and vans until 2035. Even after that, you'll still be able to buy and sell them secondhand.
Now, it's estimated that about 3.1% of all the cars on UK roads are electric, which still leaves about 29 million cars. So while the original ban on selling new petrol or diesel cars by 2030 is only 7 years away, unless God swoops down and just wipes out 29 million cars, those cars are still going to be there. So we're not talking about forcing every working class person who needs a car to buy a brand new electric car, because there'll still be lots of secondhand petrol cars in the market. The only issue is you won't be able to buy a brand new petrol car. And if that's your issue, I'm not quite sure it's the poorest people in society that you're really looking out for. Especially as you're clearly aware that society is already making the shift towards electric.
Look at how demand for electric vehicles has consistently outstripped forecasts. And I expect that by 2030, the vast majority of cars sold will be electric. And we need to strengthen our own auto industry so we aren't reliant on heavily subsidised, carbon-intensive imports from countries like China.
His wording there is incredible. For starters, his government has been weakening our auto industry. His trade minister, Kemi Badenoch, has admitted that their Brexit has been traumatic for the auto industry. And as a result, they've had to subsidize our auto industry with millions and millions of taxpayer money. And yet somehow he's pointing the finger at China for subsidizing their industry. And even in the last 24 hours, our car industry, specifically Ford UK, said that this move today is further weakening the auto industry. Because several of our major manufacturers have been shaping their business models around the idea that they no longer be selling petrol cars after 2030. So they've been gearing everything towards electric, and now Rishi Sunak has just pulled the rug from under their feet. With Ford saying, our business needs 3 things from the UK government: ambition, commitment, and consistency. A relaxation of 2030 would undermine all 3. We need the policy focus trained on bolstering the EV market in the short term and supporting consumers while headwinds are strong. Infrastructure remains immature, Tariffs loom and the cost of living is high. For the record, when the chair of Ford UK, Lisa Brankin, talks about tariffs looming, she's talking about the tariffs that kick in at the next stage of Brexit. I'm also curious to know how many of the 2 million jobs that he previously said that this green revolution in 2030 would create are now no longer going to exist because of his new announcement. Like, the Tories have celebrated how various car battery factories have set up in the UK in recent years, but those battery factories would have based their business models on being the only game in town by 2030. That's no longer the case. But my favourite bits were the crap that he said around the announcement to try and package it politically. For example, the reason for the electric cars announcement is because ever since the Tories won the by-election in Uxbridge, which they believe they won because of Labour's plans for a ULEZ tax on high-polluting cars, they've been holding themselves out as the great protectors of British drivers against Labour's war against motorists. So Rishi Sunak is only doing this because he thinks it's his best shot to win the election, which makes saying this next bit super hypocritical.
And can we put the long-term interests of our country before the short-term political needs of the moment? And this is because too often, motivated by short-term thinking, politicians have taken the easy way out.
Then he complained about the politics behind the net zero goal in general,
and without any meaningful democratic debate about how we get there.
Which is basically parroting the GB News Nigel Farage agenda that we need to have a referendum before we tackle climate change in any meaningful way. So just like David Cameron deciding his policy based on what the UKIPs of the world want him to do, because that always goes so well.
I've spent my first year as Prime Minister bringing back stability to our economy.
He's claiming to be an agent of stability. He supported Brexit, which disabled our parliament for 4 years. He took part in the Partygate lawbreaking, which brought our government under investigation. It was his resignation that brought down Boris Johnson's government, leading to an entire summer of the Tories fighting each other for the top spot. Instead of agent of stability, I'd probably go with agent of chaos.
Those decisions, the decisions that could bring real change, change that could alter the trajectory of our country, can be so caveated, so influenced by special interests.
Yeah, the Conservative Party takes millions in donations from fossil fuel companies, and Rishi Sunak's wife's family business just did a £1 billion deal with BP. And now Rishi Sunak is making sure that the UK buys more petrol cars? Yeah, the influence of special interests feels strong there. And what he says about his daughters, and by extension younger generations in general, is interesting because we're talking about things like getting landlords to insulate homes so that our energy bills are lower.
And mandatory home upgrades for property owners in just 2 years' time.
So when he says...
That's why I have no problem whatsoever defending it, not just to my daughters, who, quite frankly, these aren't, it's not them who are going to have to fork out 10 grand.
Yeah, but they're going to have to live in a world with an even worse climate disaster and higher energy bills because he wants to protect landlords. But my favorite bit of the preamble was this, because close your eyes and imagine he's saying this about Brexit, because it works perfectly.
I know people in our country are frustrated with our politics. I know they feel that much gets promised, but not enough is delivered. That we've stumbled into a consensus about the future of our country that no one seems to be happy with. But put simply, that isn't enough. If for too many there remains a nagging sense that the path we're on, no matter which party is in government, isn't quite what we hoped for, and that no one seems to have the courage to say so. Can we be honest when the facts change, even if it's awkward? But it cannot be right for Westminster to impose such significant costs on working people, especially those who are already struggling to make ends meet, and to interfere so much in people's way of life without a properly informed national debate. Since I've become Prime Minister, I've examined our plans, and I don't think they meet that test.
Really?
We seem to have defaulted to an approach which will impose unacceptable costs on hard-pressed British families.
Insane.
Costs that no one was ever really told about.
Yeah! Dude has the self-awareness of a frisbee. I'm Femi. This has been F Politics, just trying to make sure that politics doesn't F you. Have a great week.